Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. There are few people I can think of who are better spoken, better read, and more knowledgeable when it comes to an authentically, traditionally Catholic understanding of the Church, her governance, her ecclesiology, the role of the Supreme Pontiff, and the bishops than the guest that I'm interviewing in this episode. And such topics are especially relevant now in light of the Vatican's meeting with the head of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, which took place in Rome on February 12th. And the meeting, of course, came after the SSPX declared that it would consecrate bishops this summer without papal mandate, risking a repeat of 1988, when their founder, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, consecrated 4 bishops in defiance of the Holy See, resulting in automatic excommunications. Now, at the time, he claimed it was a state of necessity, it was a state of emergency, the same argument the SSPX is making now. John Salza attended SSPX masses for about 15 years, and at times he gave talks at their priories, at their chapels. He's read everything Lefebvre has ever written, and so he's deeply familiar with their theology and their mission. John is a Catholic apologist, author, speaker, and attorney known for his razor-sharp defense of traditional Catholic doctrine, biblical apologetics, and critiques of Freemasonry and modern ecclesial errors. He's published numerous books, including the Biblical Basis series, Masonry Unmasked, the Mystery of Predestination, and True or False Pope, Refuting Sedevacantism and Other Modern Errors, which he co-wrote with Robert Siscoe. It's a book that was actually endorsed by the SSPX. Our discussion is rich with material to contemplate, to ponder, to pray about, and I hope that you will listen very carefully to what John says. Here's the interview. All right, John Salza, I'm so excited to have you on my show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Christine, for having me back.
Well, a lot is going on with regard to the SSPX, of course, as we know. Just had the meeting in Rome with Cardinal Fernandez and the Superior General, Father Davide Pagliarani, and I want to get your thoughts on that. But before we do so, just, for people out there who may not know who you are, could you just give a quick introduction, specifically how long you were in the SSPX, and then, when did you start to decide to leave?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Sure, I'm a cradle Catholic, born and raised. I'm a practicing Catholic for, pretty much my entire life. You've already mentioned my brief sojourn into Freemasonry when I got out of law school, and I found out that that was a no-no, so I was able to get out of that. And then I really went into Catholic apologetics. I started my apologetics apostolate around 1999, so it's been a long time. I've written a dozen books and countless articles and talks trying to preach and promote and defend the faith, consistent with my Dominican vocation. I'm a lay Dominican. I found myself, when I moved a number of years ago, looking for the TLM. And based upon the map, I had 2 options. One was about an hour and 10 minutes away, and one was 15 minutes away. And that was the Society Chapels. That was the closest. So I began attending Mass there on Sunday with my family while I was attending the diocesan Latin Mass during the week. As I worked downtown Milwaukee, we had a diocesan Latin Mass during the week, but on the weekends I would go to the society. And so I didn't go there for doctrinal reasons or any type of, hey, I'm standing with Archbishop Lefebvre and the schismatic movement. It was nothing like that. It was just to raise my kids and my family in the old rite. I thought that's what I wanted to do. And frankly, it was the right decision. I just went about it the wrong way because I took the easy way. I took the closest parish, and with young kids at the time, that seemed appropriate to do. But I did question some of the things that the priests, preached about and talked about, but it really wasn't until after I co-wrote the book, True or False Pope, with my co-author and colleague, Robert Siscoe, that I began to see problems, inconsistencies, even theological errors between all of the traditional Catholic theology that I had been studying for so many years, all the theological manuals and so forth, and the teachings of the Society and Archbishop Lefebvre. Ironically, it was the Society who, published and supported and endorsed that book that Robert and I wrote, because it was chiefly a book against Sedevacantism. But as Robert and I kind of independently realized, the very arguments that we were using to refute Sedevacantism principally applied to the society as well. And it just took us an extra step to reach that conclusion. All of the ecclesiological issues, in the fact that they do not have canonical mission, they don't have bishops with ordinary jurisdiction, they don't have priests who are incarnated, they don't have the faculties to say mass, they don't have the authority to do anything other than this unique anomaly of having the faculties to hear confession and contingently, potentially marriages. We really concluded, and rightly concluded, and this is what the church has always said, that they were in the same boat as any other schismatic group, such as the Old Catholics. There is a parallel with the society, by the way, in the Old Catholics, as you may know, and you can read about this in some of the encyclicals of Blessed Pius IX. The Old Catholics were a group who broke off from the church right after the First Vatican Council because they rejected the council's definition of papal infallibility. And what did they do? They broke off and they consecrated their own bishop without pontifical mandate, against the will of the Holy Father, and they were excommunicated as schismatics. Well, history repeats itself. This is precisely what Archbishop Lefebvre did in 1988. Now, he began separating from the church much earlier than that, beginning in the early 70s, but he followed the same playbook. I say the schismatics always follow the same playbook. They think that they're saving the church by doing something that's actually against the unity of the church. And in this case, Lefebvre did the same thing. He consecrated bishops without pontifical mandate, more importantly, contrary to the canonical will and warning of the Holy Father, which is necessarily a schismatic act, and that's because he rejected the teachings of Vatican II. So here we go, a repeat of history, another bishop who chooses to consecrate other bishops and create this parallel church, if you will, because they oppose some of the teachings of the council. Only I think in Lefebvre's case, it was even worse because they were opposing teachings of the council that either were ambiguous or not really even considered de fide or technically binding. And I think we do have some freedom to debate the extent to which some of the novelties bind or not. But in any event, he took matters into his own hands, consecrated bishops. As you know, Christine, John Paul II, then declared that to be a schismatic act and excommunicated them, and also declared that anyone who would formally adhere to that movement, the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, this movement whereby they're assuming for themselves a mission that they do not have, because mission comes from the Pope alone. If anyone would adhere to that movement, they would also be subject to the canonical censure of excommunication for schism. And so, fast forward now to 2026, nothing has changed between the society and Rome other than the gracious mercy that Pope Francis showed upon them by granting them faculties to hear confessions, the reason for which was the fact that their confessions had been invalid for 50 years. We can also refer to Pope Benedict's lifting of the declared censures on the 4 bishops, and that was done for purposes of trying to integrate them back into the church, but that didn't happen. So we're now kind of at the same impasse that they were in 1988. Are they willing to accept the very reasonable conditions? And these haven't been explicated yet, but we know what they were in the past, of simply accepting the church's profession of faith, recognizing that Vatican II is a legitimate council, recognizing that the 1969 missal is a legitimate missal, and where there's freedom to discuss or debate, let that happen. I think that's important. But in no case can a bishop consecrate bishops without the consent and expressly contrary to the will of the Holy Father, without inflicting a grave injury upon the unity of the church. So this is where we are today.
And that is what Cardinal Fernandez reminded Father Paul Urani in their meeting. He reminded them that if they go ahead with the consecrations according to Canon 1387, they will be excommunicated, late sententiae. Let me get your thoughts on that meeting, because Cardinal Fernandez, there are a couple of people who hopped online immediately and said, Rome is just offering them further dialogue and nothing more. Well, they're actually offering them much more than that, the possibility of what Cardinal Fernandez said, a canonical statute. We don't know what form that will take, but Cardinal Fernandez made clear that there were doctrinal issues that have to be worked out first before we can even get to that point. And Could you address some of those doctrinal issues? First of all, the first question, though, is I want to ask you, because I hear, so many people have weighed in on this, many of them, quite frankly, misinformed. And a lot of people are saying things like, oh, well, if the Vatican just laid off the liturgy, everything would be fine. Is this about liturgy or is this about doctrine?
Well, frankly, Christine, I think ultimately it's about neither. I think this is about the fact that the society wants independence from the Roman Catholic Church. That's what I think it ultimately is about. And the fact that they've amassed assets all over the world. They want to remain independent. They certainly don't want to turn that over to the Holy See. And the reality is they actually reject the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And I can do a whole podcast about that. And in fact, I will. They reject the profession of faith. For example, promulgated by John Paul II. They reject core doctrines on indefectibility and mission and jurisdiction and ecclesiology and so forth. So, they want to claim it's about doctrine, and yet they don't believe in the traditional doctrines of the Catholic Church. So I don't buy that. But if Cardinal Fernandez, what he said is he's going to be considering offering them a canonical statute, what that means is, and that's legalese for the way in which they would be incorporated into the Catholic Church. Why is that? Well, the reason, Christine, is because the SSPX is not part of the Roman Catholic Church. They were founded in 1970 by Archbishop Lefebvre as nothing more than a pious union, which was really nothing more than a lay association. Remember, Lefebvre...
So they were not founded as a society of priests.
Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was founded as a society of seminarians, and that's why it was founded as a pious union, which is technically under the 17 Code a lay association. Those seminarians were to be ordained priests under the formation of Archbishop Lefebvre, but they were not going to be ordained under Lefebvre. They were to be ordained for the local diocesan bishops. They were going to have mission and jurisdiction in the dioceses. Lefebvre was only forming them for that purpose. So this was never founded as an organization or priestly fraternity, as they now call it today. That's not, look at its statutes. That's not how it was founded. But the point there is, even as a pious union, they were founded on what's called an ad experimentum basis, meaning if everything went well, the Holy See would renew them again, and then they potentially could get a canonical status after that. The first period was a 6-year period. There would have typically been another 6-year period, and then they would have become part of the Catholic Church, potentially as another church or a personal prelature. We can talk about what that means. But what happened was, given Lefebvre's disobedience and separation from the church, the society was suppressed formally by none other than Paul VI, the Holy Father, the supreme authority. And so the society, as an organization, if you will, was wiped off the canonical map in 1975. And that's why they're not part of the Roman Catholic Church. The society does not have bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. They don't have territorial jurisdiction over a diocese or personal jurisdiction. They don't have the authority to teach and sanctify and govern. They're what's called acephalous, or without a head, or vagus priests, which under Canon 265 is absolutely forbidden in the Catholic Church. And so when Cardinal Fernandez says a resolution would be through a canonical statute, he is saying, because you're not part of the Catholic Church, if we can agree to terms and conditions, we will bring you in to the church. There would be a legal structure that would be created to incorporate them into the church. And I'm guessing it would be a personal prelature, which is like Opus Dei. It's a structure which complements a diocese, right? And so the faithful in a diocese, can be served by the priests of the prelature, but that prelature is under the authority of a diocesan bishop, like Opus Dei. The priests do not have territorial jurisdiction. They would only have a personal jurisdiction, and they would be subject to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. That's how things work in the Catholic Church. And so, again, this has always been offered to the society. What is astounding to me is that, and I'm not privy to every detail, but details were made back in 2012, I believe, of the proposed conditions to Bishop Fillet by Benedict XVI, among which included simply accepting the profession of faith, which everyone in the Catholic Church has to accept, especially anyone who holds office in the Church, to recognize the council as a valid ecumenical council, to recognize the 69 Missal as legitimately promulgated by the Supreme Authority, which it was, and then there may be a place for them. But the society has seemed to thumb their nose at this potential negotiation before it's even begun, and has already declared that they're going to do a consecration of bishops with or without the Pope's approval, which is like, that's the worst way to start a negotiation. It's like, we don't need you. We're going to do what we want unless we get, even if we don't get what we want. So not a good way to start things. It looks like a repeat of 1988 to me.
Do you think that the situation is different now? I mean, do you think it's worse now with the consecrations, or the same?
Well, I think the condition in the church is, I think it's better, putting aside some of the problems we had in the pontificate of Pope Francis, and I won't sugarcoat that. There were some problems in that pontificate, but that's neither here nor there, because no matter how good or bad a pope is, it never gives a bishop a right to consecrate bishops and start a parallel church. I mean, time out right there. You can't do that. But certainly we have many more traditional Latin masses throughout the world since 1988, particularly because of the Fraternity of St. Peter and Institute of Christ the King, and even diocesan priests saying that mass. So at least from a traditional mass standpoint, I firmly believe the situation is much better today than it was in 88. In fact, I see in Novus Ordo parishes, and we didn't have this in the 70s and 80s growing up, but all the ones that I see, and maybe I'm lucky because I live in Wisconsin, I spend a lot of time in Green Bay, and it's very Catholic there. All the Novus Ordo parishes, have kneelers or communion rails. People are always receiving kneeling on the tongue. The priests all say the long canon. There's males in the sanctuary. There's reverence. The Mass is celebrated beautifully in many places. And again, I didn't see that in the 80s. When I was growing up, there was a lot of free-for-alls going on. I'm sure you can relate to that too. So, doctrinally, I think we're at the same place we were in 88. The society claims that their positions have not changed. And guess what? The Holy See is not going to change their positions. If you're a Catholic, you accept the council, you accept the new Mass, you accept the profession of faith, and you submit yourself to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, or you ain't Catholic. And that's where the impasse is right now.
Right. I actually live in South Carolina, and I'm also blessed because the Archdiocese generally tends to have pretty strong Orthodox priests. And from the parishes that I've been to, I haven't been to too many, but they generally tend to offer very reverent Novus Ordo. So I just find it interesting every time we bring up the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, you've always got one SSPXer or many SSPXers actually bringing up a clown Mass or one of the really outrageous Masses out there, which I think they're a rarity. I mean, they're not happening all the time. So
has that ever happened? I don't know. I can't personally say it has, but if you see a picture of it somewhere on their internet, of course, it's happening everywhere, right?
Right.
There's a distinction between what Robert Siscoe and I have called the actual or real crisis in the church and the apparent crisis in the church. The society and those of their ilk are always promoting, what I think is really, the not the real, but the apparent, right? They tend to take an exception and make it the rule. So if they see a bad Mass somewhere, then the Mass must be bad everywhere. Or if this bishop says something modernist, all the bishops are modernists, right? This is what they do. They kind of invert reality that way. But Christine, they have to do that in order to justify their non-authorized mission. They have to make Holy Mother Church look as bad as it possibly can look. This is their business. This is what they have to do. This is what keeps them alive. This is what gives them oxygen. This is what gives their fraudulent apostolate oxygen, by constantly pointing out how bad things are in the church. And I'm not diminishing the crisis, but again, there's a distinction between what is actual and what is only apparent.
Right. Let's dig into the new Mass, because the SSPX has much more extreme views on the new Mass than most people understand. get into these debates and I see a lot of lay people defending the SSPX. Most of them don't even go to the SSPX chapels. They're just sympathetic because they think, oh, these people just want to have the traditional liturgy. That's all. We should accommodate them. Why is Rome being so hard on them? But I do want to read a quote. This is directly from the SSPX website. It's their article titled, "Is the New Mass Legit?" This is the full quote here. "The correct definition of evil, lack of a do-good, clearly shows that the new Mass is evil in and of itself, regardless of the circumstances. It is not evil by positive profession of heresy. It is evil by lacking what Catholic dogma should profess: the true sacrifice, the real presence, the ministerial priesthood." What do you think of that? Is that
well? That's
blasphemous?
why they're heretics. Yeah, that's why they're heretics. Because if the Pope would have bound the Church to an evil rite, then the Church has defected. I mean, that
Correct.
statement alone comes under the anathema of the Council of Trent, because they're claiming that a rite of the Catholic Church is an incentive to impiety. And go read the canonical statutes and anathemas, yourself. They are anathematized for holding that statement. It's so absurd, it almost bears no further comment. I would say that they fail to distinguish between the actual rite itself, the rubrics that are in black and white, okay, and the way that rite may be celebrated. Maybe it's not reverently celebrated. Of course, that's the case in certain parishes. But to fail to make that distinction, right? They're actually attacking the missal itself, the rite of Mass that was promulgated by the Holy Father, and calling it evil. That's anathema. The Church can't give incentives to impiety. Okay.
Can you explain that though for lay people who think that that this is a reasonable position? I mean, can you talk about the indefectibility of the Church? Can it even promulgate something evil?
It's not possible. It's not possible because the Church is indefectible. Christ's promises apply to the Church as a whole, that the gates of hell will not prevail against her. And the fathers of the Church all say the gates of hell are heresies. I mean, right? The gates of hell are heresies, and those that would introduce heresies into the Church to pull them away from the true faith. Well, that's what they're claiming the new Mass does. They're actually claiming that the new Mass is pulling people away from the true faith. And if that's the case, then the Church has defected. And whoever says the Church has defected is denying a dogma of indefectibility. But you know what, Christine? That's just what Archbishop Lefebvre said as well. They're just saying what Lefebvre said. I can give you quote after quote from Lefebvre, who said that the Roman Catholic Church is no longer the Catholic Church. That's heretical, because the Church cannot defect in her mission. Otherwise, Christ has lied, his promises have failed, and we can forget about it. We might as well do something else. That's a total impossibility. And any time they want to defend the society's view of the Mass, I would ask them this: are they aware that the society priests don't even have the faculties to say Mass? That they are not authorized to celebrate Mass? Ask any canon lawyer, anybody conversant in canon law, they will know that. There's nothing traditional about a group of priests who celebrate Mass when they don't have the faculties to do that, because every time they do that, they're committing sacrilege. And those who participate in those Masses, whether they know it or not, are objectively participating in that same sin. This is what the Church has always taught about vagus, acephalous, independent priests that are doing mission without the proper canonical structure and mission from the Holy Father and from bishops who actually are true bishops of the faith. So I'll stop there and see if you have any other comments or questions.
Well, I know you've answered this question many times, but for the viewers out there who are hearing this for the first time, what is your response to the SSPX argument, which they're using now for the consecrations, the same arguments they used in 1988? It's a state of emergency, therefore this is justified.
An emergency to do what? I mean, that's my first question. And a state of necessity to do what, actually? Well, 1752, the last code of canon law, is for the salvation of souls. Okay, stop right there. Are you saying that we can't save our souls in the Roman Catholic Church? Because again, if that's what you're saying, then the Church has defected. Then the gates of hell have prevailed. Then the promises of Christ are for naught, and we can go elsewhere, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. So when we say a state of necessity or crisis, what does that actually mean? and who determined when it started and who's going to determine when it ends. It's an argument that's nothing more than a smokescreen, Christine, to justify an illicit mission. It is really all it is. I mean, the church herself, Holy Mother Church, has addressed necessity and tells us when a necessity exists. And there is no such thing as a necessity to implement a parallel hierarchy of bishops and priests who claim to have a universal mission and jurisdiction to perform whatever acts they want throughout the world. That's completely absurd, and yet that's actually what they're practically claiming. When we talk about necessity, there's a rule which says, okay, the church in her mission has the ability to save souls. And in cases where human law may impede that ability, then the divine law comes in and says we need to save souls, and we can circumvent certain human laws. An example of this would be when we talk about necessity, the most obvious case that comes to mind is a case where somebody is in danger of death, and there is a priest, who is excommunicated and hence doesn't have the faculty to absolve. Well, the church would say in that particular case of necessity, the church would allow that priest to absolve a penitent in danger of death. That's the necessity. Canon law addresses certain cases of necessity. Common error is another one. Positive and probable doubt under Canon 144, in danger of death. The church has already addressed this necessity argument in her canon law because she wants to make sure that the divine law of the salvation of souls is being carried out. The problem with the society is, number one, canon law doesn't support their interpretation of what necessity means, but number two, it's even worse than that. The Society of St. Pius X is circumventing not canon law, but divine law. And this is what people have to understand. The Pope alone has the authority to select and consecrate and send bishops. The Pope alone. That is magisterial teaching that I can cite from Pius VI, Pius IX, Pius XII, the Council of Trent. There's no question about that. It's the sole and exclusive right of Peter and his successors to determine who enters the College of Bishops, because the Pope is the head of the College of Bishops. And therefore, it's not possible for one to enter into the College of Bishops contrary to the will of the head of the college. You see, that is a question of divine law. So the society wants to claim that, they're doing everything according to the salvation of souls. Well, the way Christ set up the mission to save souls is through the Vicar of Christ and the College of Bishops. That's how souls are saved. He gives the Pope immediate plenary and universal jurisdiction over the church to then make bishops as part of the College of Bishops, who act as another a subject of his supreme authority when in union with him. And it is through that divine constitution of the Roman primacy and the episcopate that souls are saved. What the Society of St. Pius X is proposing is to circumvent the divine constitution of the Catholic Church and consecrate bishops against the will of the Holy Father, who's the head of the college, in a mission that they haven't been given. It's completely contrary to divine law. And I'm not the only one saying this. If anybody picks up a theology manual or reads some of the literature and scholarship on this, they'll see it. Again, I would go to trueorfalsepope.com and look at some of the articles I've written, which specifically cite the magisterial texts supporting what I'm saying, that the Pope alone has this authority. And yes, it's true that this notion of apostolic mandate is relatively recent. It didn't exist in the early church. But the point is that the Pope always had the authority to either approve or reject episcopal consecrations. In cases in the past, Christine, where we didn't have the means of communication that we did, there was generally a presumption of tacit approval, right? If an Eastern bishop would consecrate another bishop, there would be this notion of tacit approval, unless the Pope got word of it, would reject it, okay? As things evolved and as modern communications improved, and particularly under the reign of Pius XII, they wanted to ensure the integrity of the divine constitution of the church and to prevent schism. And that's where Pius XII required an apostolic mandate. But never in the history of the church could a bishop be consecrated contrary to the will of the Holy Father, because as the popes teach, that is a prerogative that Jesus Christ himself gave to Peter alone, because Christ alone chose his apostles and sent his apostles, right? And so the vicar of Christ alone chooses and sends the successors of the apostles. That's why this is divine law revealed in Scripture. And so there is no necessity, getting back to your question, it's kind of a long-winded answer, but there is no case of necessity that would allow one to circumvent the divine law. And that's because the divine law of Jesus Christ foresees all things. It foresees all cases of necessity and all cases of crisis. It's part of the divine law, and that is because the church in her mission could never fail. It could never fail. And so for the society to say, and I heard one of the society priests last weekend give a sermon and say, all of the parishes throughout the world no longer have the ordinary means of salvation. That's what he said verbatim. What is he saying there? He's saying that the Roman Catholic Church is defected, just like Lefebvre. That's heretical. Every Catholic should know that's heretical. And it's a complete circumvention of the way that Christ instituted the church.
Right. I mean, it's not very different from what Martin Luther said, right?
Not at all.
And I mean, you've spoken about this as well, and I'm surprised a lot of people don't know this, but the SSPX urges its faithful not to attend Novus Ordo Masses and rather to stay home if they have no other choice, to stay home rather than fulfill their Sunday obligation at a Novus Ordo Masses. Catholics, we know, if you miss your holy day, it's a mortal sin. So they're asking, actually counseling. In their eyes, they don't think it's a mortal sin. They think if you attend the Mass, it's a mortal sin. But what are your thoughts on that?
They're leading souls to damnation for that. Now, that's just the fact. And that is also, Christine, the definition of schism right there, because the definition of schism is not only refusal of subjection to the Roman primacy, the Roman pontiff, and consecrating a bishop against his will is precisely attack and a usurpation of a right to the Roman primacy. That's why it's schismatic. But schism, the other element of schism, either one of which legally suffice for the canonical crime of schism, is refusing communion with those subject to the Holy Father. And what you just articulated is precisely a refusal of communion with 99.9% of the Catholics of the Roman Rite. This is the position of the Society of St. Pius X. That is necessarily and de facto schismatic. They're admitting that they refuse communion with almost the entire Roman Catholic Church in the West. This is what they're saying. Well, guess what? That's schismatic. Period. There's no way around it. They're refusing communion with those who are subject to the Roman pontiff, in addition to refusing communion with the Roman pontiff himself.
And I know you wrote this book, True or False Pope, against Sedevacantism. It was actually endorsed at the time by the SSPX because the SSPX, at least on paper, rejects Sedevacantism. But people have leveled the criticism at them that they're actually practical Sedevacantists.
That's the only point I agree on with the Sedevacantists. And they're right to say that because they're inconsistent. I mean, it's a matter of divine law, and Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, also declared, de fide doctrine, that the Pope not only is infallible on faith and morals, but he also has supreme plenary and universal jurisdiction on matters of discipline and governments, to which we are all bound as well. Whether you like all his decisions is irrelevant, but he has that right in certainly determining who becomes a bishop and what mission a bishop has is not merely a canonical right, okay, but it's actually a right that is part of the divine law of Jesus Christ himself and how he set up the church. And if there's any point that I'd want people who are confused about this matter to study and hopefully realize is that we're talking about an organization that's attempting to circumvent Jesus Christ, the laws of Christ and how he founded his church, because one can never, ever consecrate bishops contrary to the will of the Roman pontiff. The Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, there's a document you can look up in 1996, which affirmed that. This was long after the consecrations. It was also after the Holy See found that the Hawaii Six were not subject to an excommunication. That was, I think, 91 or 93. Well, the Peace Seal came out in 96. affirming everything I'm saying. The Hawaii Six were not determined to be excommunicated for schism because of a one-off act of confirmation. They didn't find that they were formally adhering to the movement. But 3 years later, the Peace Stilt came out and said, hey, by the way, remember what John Paul II said about formal adherence to the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre? That still holds true, notwithstanding the Holy See's finding in that Hawaii Six case, because the movement is still schismatic, and anyone who would formally adhere to it, meaning anyone who would, they said, exclusively attend Lefebvrean ecclesial acts, and that was the terminology that they used, or who would believe that Archbishop Lefebvre was right to do what he did, would be in formal adherence. And the Peace Stilt said, they concluded that the priests and deacons were presumably in formal adherence because they knew exactly what they stood for. I think the question is more delicate with respect to the laity, and I put myself in that category when I was attending. Not all the laity have the information. They don't know these details. They're not formally adhering to a schism. At least some of them aren't. I think some of them are. I think the guys who are on podcasts who are promoting the society publicly, I think they should be concerned about formal adherence, because that results in automatic excommunication. Only God can judge their internal forum. But that, Christine, is still out there. And that's because under the Code of Canon Law, anyone who commits an act of schism is subject to an automatic excommunication in the internal forum, at least, which means you are barred from living the sacramental life of the church. And the only way you can get back into communion with the church is to be absolved by a priest who has the faculty to lift that censure. That's how serious it is. And so from that standpoint, we still hold, with what John Paul II taught, that a formal adherence to this movement is subject to excommunication. That's a serious matter.
Mm-hmm. I want to return just for a moment to the new Mass. And I know you've done some writing on this, and there was kind of a debate not a debate, but, disagreement between you and Kennedy Hall over whether or not Archbishop Lefebvre ever offered the new Mass. And he was adamant that he had never done so, but you turned up some evidence that he did.
Yeah, I have evidence that he did. It doesn't really matter to me whether he did or didn't, because I'm not judging Archbishop Lefebvre upon his preference for the 62 Missal. I'm not judging him upon that at all. And so if somebody can correct me on that, I've written an article, and I think the preponderance of the evidence suggests that he did, at least for a funeral. I'm not saying that he did it on a recurring basis, but to me, it's not relevant. Number one, what's relevant to me is they don't have the faculties to say Mass. They're committing sacrilege every time they do. And I've also proven that those Masses don't fulfill the Sunday obligation. That's really what's important to me, from the standpoint of being an apologist and trying to help people save their souls. So I would judge Lefebvre not on that, but rather on his separation from the church, his direct, not only disobedience, but schism, because disobedience, can be licit, in some cases, which it wouldn't be called disobedience. But when you're talking about again and again and again, circumventing the divine law of usurping a right that belongs to the Pope, which is precisely what Lefebvre and the five bishops did, you can't get around that. That's where you have the problem of schism, and that's where I would judge Lefebvre based upon that act.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you're a person who loves tradition. I love tradition, in spite of the people who've lied about me saying that I'm on a vendetta against tradition or I hate tradition. Absolutely false. I started attending the traditional Latin Mass probably more than 20 years ago. So, I had all my children baptized in the old rite and made sure that all of these things. So both of us absolutely love tradition. People can't bring that up as some sort of weapon against us. And, a lot of traditionalists have been sympathetic to the SSPX. But it's interesting because with the announcement of the upcoming consecration, some of these same people are now actually kind of turning against them. They're very upset with them. For instance, Dr. Joseph Shaw of the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales, he said recently, quote, "We've waited patiently for Pope Leo to consider relaxing Latin Mass restrictions. The SSPX has now thrown a hand grenade into this, and I'm actually seeing other people like him who maybe were once a little sympathetic with the SSPX, now actually very frustrated because they feel like they're setting things back with this. What are your thoughts?"
They should be. As I represent clients in my profession, and you know about this too, right? I mean, you don't start a negotiation saying, hey, by the way, I don't care how this negotiation goes, we're doing what we're doing with or without you. I mean, that's really how they started this. And yet here, Cardinal Fernandez and the Holy See is trying to be patient with Palirani and the society and hoping they can have a dialogue, because there truly are doctrinal issues that have to be resolved here for the sake of the society's souls. I mean, after all, the society rejects the profession of faith. They accuse Holy Mother Church of heresy for teaching collegiality, which they don't understand. That's a topic of another day. And I could go on and on and on about that. These are doctrinal issues that Rome is correct to say we need to resolve these, because if we're going to give you a canonical statute, let's say a personal prelature, we need to ensure that you're not leading the faithful astray. But that's exactly what the society has been doing for 50 years, not just on a doctrinal level. And all of these errors that people have today, that they embrace today, about they don't understand what the Catholic Church is or what a bishop with jurisdiction is, they don't understand so many things. A lot of these errors started with Lefebvre, but it's not just the doctrinal issues that the society, errors, I should say, that the society has promoted, but think of all of the invalid confessions and marriages that the Society of St. Pius X is responsible for over the last 50 years. It's frightening to think about that, not to mention the fact that they've erected their own schismatic marriage tribunal. And again, what deleterious effect that has had on so many countless souls over the years. So this group truly is schismatic. It is a danger to souls. Doctrinal issues definitely have to be resolved before they would ever even hope of having a place in the Roman Catholic Church. And God willing, a special grace will come to them for them to recognize that, if they would accept the true de fide teachings of the church. And I'm not talking about an inability to debate non-doctrinal or problematic statements, because the Cardinal Pozzo or Archbishop Pozzo and others who have dealt with the society have acknowledged they do have some room to debate and discuss issues. But we're talking, Christine, about mission, jurisdiction, indefectibility, the profession of faith, and so forth. These are core doctrines of the faith, and they're leading Catholics astray. They're actually leading Roman Catholics outside of the Catholic Church and into their heretical and schismatic movements, outside of which these Catholics cannot save their souls. Let's call a spade a spade. The SSPX is not part of the Roman Catholic Church. Everybody understand that. They ain't part of it. They don't have bishops with mission or jurisdiction. They don't have priests that have faculties to say Mass. They're not authorized to teach, sanctify, or govern, with some exceptions. And so this is what it means to be Catholic. This is why we're Catholic. Being Catholic, when we say we're Catholic, that means we all share a threefold bond with our bishop in faith, worship, and governance. None of that applies to Society of St. Pius X. They're outside of it. Christine, here's the key problem that I wanted to get to before. When people see the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, they equate that with tradition. And that's where they stop, okay? Without regard to whether that priest on that altar has the permission to say Mass, whether he has a bishop, whether the bishop has commissioned him with a mission, whether he's teaching heresy, whether he's committing sacrilege up there because he doesn't have the faculties, and on and on and on. All they see are the smells and bells, and they equate that with tradition. That's not tradition. The old Catholics celebrate the old Mass too. The Sedevacantists celebrate the 62 Missal as well. Are they Catholic? They don't have bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. They teach all kinds of errors and heresies. Their priests don't have the faculties to say Mass or to do anything. But are they Catholic? No, they're not. And that's what I call part of the false church of tradition. That's what we're seeing now. I think this could be the great apostasy, because so many Catholics are being deceived into thinking that because a man wears a cassock and faces the east while he says Mass, he's a traditional Catholic. That's how superficial Catholics' understanding of the faith is today. And this is what has to change. And that's why I'm in this fight, to educate them that being a Catholic means you're practically in submission to the jurisdiction of your bishop, which then unites you to the Pope. And that's part of the divine constitution of the church. That's how Christ set it up. The bishop, even though he may have territorial jurisdiction over a diocese, he is ruling by virtue of the divine authority that Christ has given him. Because as the scripture says, that the bishops are appointed by the Holy Ghost to rule and govern the churches of God. And if you are not united to your bishop, you're not a Roman Catholic. You're outside the church, and you can't save your soul there. So it's not just about who's saying the TLM, Christine. It's something that has become so deceptive. But that's not the sine qua non of Catholicism. Yes, I prefer that right myself, but there's a lot more you need to ask in order to be a Catholic. The first of which is, have they been sent? Read the scriptures. What did St. Paul say? How can we preach unless we are sent? That's revelation. That's what God has revealed to us. Well, these men are not sent, and therefore they should be rejected, because as the Council of Trent says, whoever says they're licit ministers without having been sent by canonical authority, let him be anathema. Okay, so anybody out there publicly supporting the society's mission when it doesn't have a mission is anathema. That's as serious as it gets.
Right. Well, I appreciate your clarity. I don't think there's anybody else better spoken than you on this issue, better informed, more read on this. You've clearly been thinking about this and writing about this for a very long time. Could you tell people where they can find your work if they want to learn more?
Well, thank you, Christine. They can go to our website, trueorfalsepope.com. I have many, many articles. I've written dozens of articles on various topics about the society as I've really prayerfully researched this question. And it started when I was attending their chapel. So this goes back quite a few years now. I would also mention that Robert Siscoe and I have a podcast. We're long overdue for another episode, but that's called Trad Answers. And we are going to be putting out podcasts dealing with particular issues on this Society of St. Pius X matter. So stay tuned for that.
Oh, and actually, before we go, I do want you to respond to some of these objections, because I invariably get comments, when I bring you up or I play a clip of you, people say, oh, but he was a Freemason, or no, he secretly practices Freemasonry because in 2018 he accepted an award from the Order of the Sons and Daughters of Italy in America, and that's a Freemasonic lodge. Can you please respond to that?
Oh, gosh. Thank you for that opportunity. Yeah. If you look at that picture, I'm standing next to Governor Scott Walker. He was the former governor of Wisconsin, and his wife. That is an organization, I think you've already addressed this, Christine, founded, I think, in 1905 to honor Italian Americans who've succeeded in their professional life. And I had the fortune to be selected to receive the reward, through my, law practice and the apologetics I've done. So I was honored to receive that. But, it's interesting, I think, because the Sons and Daughters of Italy call their meeting places lodges throughout the country. That may have been why they confused that with Masonic Lodge. But we got them now. They jump on that. Right. And you've said it before too, right? I mean, I've been a cradle Catholic. I'm a cradle Catholic my whole life. And when I was solicited to join Freemasonry when I graduated from law school, I was 26 years old. I got out of it after 2.5 years. And this was, let's see, almost 30 years ago, 28 years ago. I mean, they're still bringing that up, really. I have spent the last 2.5 decades fighting against Freemasonry, exposing Freemasonry. I've published all the rituals. I've published 2 books and written countless articles against Freemasonry. So when somebody brings that up, I laugh and say, yep, they can't refute my arguments. That Exactly. Just to me highlights ad hominem to a T.
Yeah, it's just classic deflection. That's all it is, because they can't respond to your arguments. And just to, confirm, in case people are still confused, that lodge was not a Masonic lodge. That order has no affiliation whatsoever with the Freemasons. I think there was some confusion because the founder privately joined.
The Order Sons of Italy, has absolutely no affiliation with anybody, and especially with Freemasonry at all. And many of the people, as you can imagine, are actually practicing Catholics, and so would despise Freemasonry, but there's no association whatsoever.
Correct. So people,
and if you don't believe me, why don't you write them or email them? They'll let you know.
or just do 5 minutes of research online, really, because that's all it took for me. Really, that's all it took. But thank you so much, John. I really appreciated this. I know we could talk about this for hours, but we're going to have to end here.
Thanks for the good work you're doing, Christina. I appreciate it too.
Thank you very much. Obviously, I focus on a different aspect. I focus more on the investigative journalism and exposing, unfortunately, sex abuse, which is rampant in the SSPX. That's a different, but I will agree with you. I think you brought up a good point when you say that the SSPX doesn't want to, they don't want to hand things over to the Vatican. They don't want their supervision. They don't want their oversight. I think the same applies, quite frankly, to that abuse issue. I don't think that they want the Vatican oversight over that. Because honestly, I think they would find a lot. And in my experience, the SSPX is about 30 years behind the church in child protection, because the church, of course, had to go through this horrible, the Boston Globe spotlight and the abuse scandals and the bankruptcies and all the lawsuits. And so the church has had to, implement much stricter child protection policies. And the SSPX has basically never done that, really. Because they're, like you said, they're off, they're doing their own thing. They don't have supervision. And so they can keep all these things very secret. They can be very secret about this and not really face any sort of real accountability. So anyway, that's just my personal take.
And I'm able to say this without divulging confidential information, but I know there are people that I've been contacted by and others that there is abuse within the society, and I'm not saying it's limited to the society. Of course, what I'm saying is the society is no different than anybody else. And some of the things that I've heard is that priests are, with wives of husbands and have broken up marriages. You've probably heard of that too. And I'm not saying that's an isolated case. I'm saying that is happening more often than people believe within the society, and the way the priests are honored and where there's some abuse of authority. So they're certainly not purveyors of tradition, but I think they also suffer from many of the defects that have, been laid bare in dioceses as well. So they're no different in that regard.
Correct. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, John. God bless you in your good work. And I'm sure I'll have you back on later as soon as we find out what the the decision from the SSPX is going to be in response to Rome's offer. So
yes, be happy to talk about it.
Okay. Thank you so much. God bless you.
All right. God bless. Thank you.